Hello and welcome. I'm Amanda Casari, and I'm an open source scientist at the Google Open Source Programs Office. I'm a co-lead for Project Ocean and Across, which I'm here to talk to you about today. External faculty at Vermont Complex Systems Center, a co-founder for Open Source Stories. I'm on the board of directors for the Computational Democracy Project. I'm also a co-author with Alice Zhang for Feature Engineering for Machine Learning, which was an O'Reilly book that was published in 2018. Most importantly to me these days, I'm a queer mama and I'm a United States Navy veteran. And today we're here to talk about better contributor documentation across open source. I'm an open source researcher and engineer on the open source programs team at Google, and this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. If you prefer to follow along with slides or a transcript, which you can see yourself and not from a recording, you can get those already for this talk. So you can go to bit.ly/across-slides-upstream 2022. And a transcript is also available at bit.ly/across-transcript-upstream 2022. So I mentioned a lot of different projects and things that I'm working on, and it might lead you to ask the question of why do I care about open source contributors besides my professional work in the programs office, and why are we here to talk about that today? And so, like I said, I work in the Google OSPO, and at the Google OSPO, our mission is to bring all the value of open source to Google and all of the resources of Google to open source. Now, when you're trying to think about bringing resources of Google to open source, it's very easy to make guesses, and it's much harder to make data-informed decisions. So if you want to make data-informed decisions, you run into the challenge of data in open source. So the impact of data in open source has been talked about for a while. I feel like it was well summarized and discussed by Nadia Eghbal in her book from 2022, Roads and Bridges, The Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. There she talks about how the impact of digital infrastructure itself for open source ecosystems is very difficult to measure because we don't have data about what tools are used. And this would be like the projects that are created that hold up the rest of society. And so we don't know how much we rely on them. We don't have a clear picture of what's underfunded. But the hypothesis is that with better metrics, we could describe the economic impact of digital infrastructure. We could identify critical projects that are lacking support. And most importantly, we could start to understand the dependencies between projects and people. So this brings up the problem of data and measuring in open source. And how do we measure who is a contributor in open source? So when we look at this at Google, we ask the question of who contributes to open source. The current kind of estimation that we have been using has been using open source control and changes made to repositories hosted on 2 of those systems. And this is the best available data we have for estimating source control repository contributions. And we do recognize and incentivize contributions and their impact as a part of our larger processes. So one example we can have of this, of where we count these things and try to share them, is starting in 2020, we've been releasing an annual report on Google's contributions to open source. So in here, we try to clearly state that that data that we're representing is activities from repositories that are hosted on GitHub or on a production system, Git service, Git on Borg, and that we know that these sources only represent a subset of open source activity. So here, when we're counting active users, they've logged activity within a specified time frame. An Alphabet contributor is a full-time employee, as well as extended Alphabet community. That may temps, vendors, contractors, and interns who are contributing. And so we've stated that this picture is not complete. By focusing on source control, we are actively excluding and not counting work from strategic decision-making, from project management, from build and infrastructure and maintenance, documentation work, community management, governance, financial management, the list goes on. And so we have to be able to consider then, if we know that this is incomplete, do different methods to count contributors' impact, who is seen as a contributor, who gets the credit. And so for this, we worked with our partnership, the Open Source Complex Ecosystems and Networks, this is Project Ocean, with the Vermont Complex Systems Center to understand the impact of contribution estimation methods. So just brief introduction if you're not familiar with it. Project Ocean at the University of Vermont stems from an unrestricted gift at the Google Open Source Programs Office to the Vermont Complex Systems Center. And there, our research partners are really focusing on building a community-oriented body of research, which can understand how open source platforms are used and what makes technology-rich environments thrive. So as part of this and this work together, one of the outcomes of this was a research paper which analyzed different kinds of attribution in open source and asked the question, which contributions count? So we compared contributor attribution models used in different open source projects, ones that were automated as well as ones that were inferred, and ones that were more specific. We also challenged the question of non-code versus code categorization of contributions. There were some really interesting findings out of this. The first was this concept of generosity. So with this, the models of contribution acknowledgement required manual attribution. So like if you had a bot and you had to go in and put in the different kinds of things that happened and what can added to that, those kinds of automated processes or manual attribution processes recognized fewer contributors than models which just took different kinds of actions themselves and categorized them and showed that work. But the manual attribution of credits did cover work that was not captured by other methods, even when those other methods had proxies or inferred methodology, which would try to extrapolate work that was done based on the signals that it got from a platform or an automated system. So just to make sure I summarize this well, we're looking at the kinds of things that when the community is involved, they are more generous with the kinds of work that is acknowledged versus when systems only dictate the kind of work that is acknowledged. So second, there were large blind spots. So across open source software, a majority of contributors are acknowledged by simple methods like code commits. That's kind of like the standard. If you do a code commit, you are a contributor. But as we said earlier, those methods omit a majority of contributors from individual projects. So you don't get to see who is actually maintaining and keeping a project going and who is everyone who is a contributor within a project. Third, there's this life cycle that exists for open source software projects. I think we all kind of know this intuitively, but it was interesting to see as contributor life cycles and how they changed and how contributors tended to spread more uniformly across different types of contributions. So we didn't see a uniformity of tasks in the sense that some projects see a lot of people working on a few kinds of tasks, but we did see that people tended to work on a lot of different kinds of things over the life cycle of a project versus someone focusing on one thing all the time. And so with this, like looking at different methods of being able to describe contributors, we also had to ask the question of whether or not where those samples of data are pulling from, are those representative of the kinds of work in open source projects in general? And so there was a group of researchers who looked at what they call the penumbra of open source. So trying to find and examine and understand what do open source projects look like that are outside of centralized platforms. And what they found is that those kinds of projects are longer maintained, more academic, and more collaborative in general. And so when we start to say what represents open source, or if we're doing a representation analysis of what kind of contributions uphold open source, if we only narrowly focus on the data that is conveniently available from centralized platforms, then we're actually missing out on the fuller, richer picture of what the open source ecosystem does look like versus what we try to clean out when we're trying to have a nice story. And so why does any of this matter? This matters because I would like to make sure that we understand within this group especially, but in general, that as scientists, industry researchers, people making decisions, the data selection and the methodology you use to define who is seen as an open source contributor does matter. This means that it places a lot of emphasis on being able to understand who gets supported, where investments go, what we think is important. And so we have to take this in mind each and every time that we're doing analysis and understanding what's happening in open source. And so as the feminist geographer Joni Seeger would say, really what gets counted does truly count. And so right now, all that power of who gets counted and what gets counted gets placed then upon these platforms that we're using to really just to do development and community work. It gets placed on the people who are doing the counting to make the decisions about what data to use and what methodology to use. And I think the question I'm asking, and I'm here to ask you, is what if we shifted that power center back to the community? And we allowed communities to have the tools and the methodologies and the data representation they needed to be able to fully show who supports and maintains all of open source. And so centering this idea on community and really thinking about what is the work that is being done, then we can consider that a better way to go forward rather than using automated systems and systems that really are represented for collaboration and not for representation, is we have to think about the idea of how do we make labor more visible. And so as we're considering this, what we've come to the conclusion is that we really just need a better classification system for describing all of the contributions in open source. Again, I challenge the concept that there's a binary system that exists, because we all know what are the traps of being able to fall into binary systems. So we need to be able to describe all the kinds of contributions of open source and not fit them into code or non-code categories, as well as better mechanisms for identifying who is doing this work. So this brings us to our proposal of how to start approaching this work, which is the project and the research that we've done called ACROSS, which is the lovely backronym for Attributing Contributor Roles in Open Source Software. So ACROSS started as a concept and as a hypothesis, and we grew this into a workshop. And the reason we created a workshop for this was because the idea was that if we had a collaborative process and brought a broad group of people together, they could help us identify and define groups of activities that are valuable in open source. And at the end of each one, we would have this awesome metadata schema description that then people could go then use to show the people who are contributing to open source and the kind of work that gets done. So we really tried to center this around the idea that you create something, so some kind of outcome, a tangible thing that's done. And then our participants would help us describe the nuances and constraints of those outcomes, and then the things that people did to make them happen. So this would be the idea of like being able to fully describe that for something that everybody in open source came together to do, that we would be able to describe all the work that it took to create that and make that labor visible. And we could use this to create this repeatable, scalable framework. And this would be a way to build with projects and not for them, as a standard that we would introduce and cram everybody into. So we did this. We held 6 workshops, and it was across 2 separate time zones. We held workshops that were centered on these different things that open source did, and those were like creating repositories and sustaining them, events, organizations. We had over 30 people sign up. We actually had a lot more people sign up, but we could only fit 30 people into the workshops because we found that virtually larger groups tended to have less time for discussion and were more time doing definitions. But really, this idea behind this was that evolved over time. And by the time we were holding the last workshop, we had this great framework of really building a participatory design process to create something with a group of people. We also learned some really valuable lessons from working with so many individuals from across the open source ecosystem. One of the first lessons is that we thought we'd be really super clear. So we were going to divine these workshops. We're going to break them up and to make these schemas to talk about these different outcomes. And we'll focus on repositories and organizations and events because everybody understands and uses the same words for that. It turns out that didn't make sense. And the reason for that is because people don't use those same words to describe the same things. And some of these concepts are so intrinsically enmeshed together in open source that you can't actually separate them and still come up with work that describes what it takes to maintain them individually. So these were not the right boundaries to be drawing when we were talking about what work is done to create or sustain in open source. These were the wrong words to use. Which was also fascinating because this is deeper into the idea that words have meaning and that what they mean to others is not what they mean to you. So we had folks from a lot of different places, from industry, from hackathons, from open source ecosystems that focuses on academia. We had folks from platforms. We had folks who were entirely working on projects as volunteers. We had folks who were paid, who were not paid. And all of them had different words and languages that they brought together that did mix in interesting ways, but again, they were non-standard meanings. And some of them they had to talk about and come together and have an understanding each time and be really curious with each other about what does your concept mean? Where is this coming from? And how are we going to define this together? So what we really took away from here was that even terminology that we think is standardized in open source is not standardized and it changes between the scopes of the individuals and their experiences. We also really found by the end of the workshop series that by asking people to focus on verbs and not nouns, we were able to better help them find and be able to pull the nuances out and understanding of what is that labor and the work that's being done. So again, just like words mean this different things to different people, even when they have the same definition, focusing on things like role titles or organizational titles or what someone might be as a part of a larger organization really didn't have the same nuance, meaning, and understanding as when you were describing the kind of work they were doing. So when we asked people to really pull out and focus on the actions, we got a lot more nuance and clarification of what was happening rather than asking them to focus on the titles and who was present. So before we asked who did the work, we actually had to ask, well, what was that work that was done? And then last, we didn't actually get the schema. So we had these 6 workshops. We found them to be very successful. But as we talked about the goals in the beginning of this body of work, we didn't get these schemas or these metadata schemas out of this. We didn't get these kind of like golden things to bring to everybody else to say, if you want to talk about the labor that is upholding a repository, here is a good description of what you can start with to start giving people's names to. What we did find was that the process was super validating of bringing people together, giving them a space to talk about what was important within their community, and then giving them templates and organization and facilitation to create things for themselves. So as we say, for my colleague and friend, Erin McKeon was right. The answer usually is just, we need better documentation. So this is what Across has turned into and designed, was to create methods and frameworks for that documentation to be created by the community itself. So we took all the lessons that we learned from doing the workshops ourselves. We took all that we heard from participants and people along the way and feedback from our colleagues, and we turned this into frameworks and playbooks so that communities themselves, so again, building with them and not for them, communities can hold their own workshops with their own local facilitators to be able to create better contributor documentation. So the goal of these workshops, and we jokingly call them, there's a multiplayer and a single player option. Now, the multiplayer option is that where you bring a group of people together, you have a facilitator who's not actually participating, but is helping to guide everybody along. And the goal for those sessions at the end is to create better documentation for your contributors. And whether that's asking for them to be a contributor in the first place as a call for participation, whether it's recognizing the work that's being done after work that's already been done, if it's updating your current contributor documentation, all of this is focused on the idea, again, of making labor visible within your community. And so we do give examples just to be able to help people understand and conceptualize. When it's another thing from the workshop was we found that when we didn't have even toy examples, folks had a really hard time understanding what they were going to get out of this. So we've added some of those in a hopefully a fun way. So people can see, like, when we're talking about contributor documentation, not just the recognition of work, but also in the request. So maybe improving how we are asking for people to contribute to our project. That we're being a little more specific about the work that is valued and the skills and what they can bring to a community, rather than having them doubt whether or not they have anything to contribute based on what's already being recognized. So what's next? So the things that we've accomplished out of the workshops and the project so far, we've been writing up report summaries and trying to share those in places like this. We've been sharing those internally and with specific groups. We created the workshop playbooks so that groups can host their own across documentation sessions. We do have some train the trainer sessions for folks who want to bring across to their open source communities. And we're also working on academic and industry research summaries for our work exploring contributorship as a standard in open source ecosystems, rather than relying on platform features or what someone is listed as a role in a repository. And the goal for all of this is really that we would like to normalize attribution for contributors based on what communities think are important, not what convenient data tells us is important. And because we truly believe we can build a more inclusive picture of contribution to show what everyone brings to open source. So if you'd like to join us or keep in touch, our playbooks are available at whodoesthe.dev. You can also join our mailing list, and this is what we're using for things like train the trainer sessions or keeping people updated on when we might be holding additional workshops. So that mailing list is across-open source-workshops at googlegroups.com. You do have to have a Google account to join that. If that is not something that you prefer, then you can also keep up to date on who does the .dev, as well as using the GitHub repo, which powers that. I would like to thank all of my collaborators, co-leads, past and present, as a part of the body of work that this has taken to get to Across. You've all been wonderful and delightful. Also, especially to the co-lead for this project at Google, Katie McLaughlin. She could not be here today, but none of this work would exist without Katie and her past work before we even worked together on bringing up the idea that contributions matter and every contribution matters. So thank you very much, Katie. Thank you all for attending today. I am delighted to talk with you and to be able to answer any questions that you have.